Hello, hello. It is Amanda Kruger. I am the acting coordinator for National History Day in Wisconsin. I'll be talking through the paper workshop today. First, want to apologize. I know I had sent out an original link that will no longer be live. I had to change the privacy settings so that all could view. So I wanted to make sure everyone got visuals as well as audios so that we can have a conversation. I will also be following up on the NHD in WI Gmail if you have further questions, and then just let me know if I need to clarify anything and like that. I'm going to try to make it quick for you guys and then make sure that this recording is live for all after the event. So with that, without further ado, here's paper workshop for National History Day state finalists. We're going to first talk to a couple must-dos for the paper. We'll hopefully have a little bit of time for questions. I'll be monitoring the sideboard for that. Then we'll go through suggestions. This is probably the most that I'll talk through, and then pointing out some resources. And then at the end, I'll also be answering questions if they come in. All right. With that, the must-dos of a paper. I always want to remind you guys, check for the title page that you have it correct. The title page is very simple. It should not say what your school is. It's the basic information that is listed in the rule book. So I'll show you an example of the title page on the next page. Annotated bibliography is very easy. You've likely seen them in the last couple of years. They are MLA or Chicago format with an annotation. So what did you use the source for? And then they need to be submitted by registration deadline in PDF or doc format. It cannot be a Google Doc. I know we emailed students back and forth. If they submitted a Google Doc for the regionals, unfortunately, there is no option this time. It must be a PDF or a Word doc format. Luckily, there is no process paper, which I know is a favorite of students. So the title page, like we talked about, here's an example of a national winner from Wisconsin, Laura Balls, if you met her last year. It's just the name, title, division, so if you're a junior or senior. And importantly, it does not say your school. It doesn't have a design, it doesn't have any cover, it doesn't have extra information that isn't your name, your title, and division. So just make it really simple. Don't feel like you need to make it fancy at all. It actually is easier just to make it simple. So for basic words, historical papers should be between 1,500 words and 2,500 words. And everything in a paper counts towards the word limit. So that does include quotes. That's different than the website category if you are familiar with that. It does not apply to notes, annotated bibliography, anything you put down at the bottom. I know a lot of students will often count their MLA formatting. If you use MLA for your in-text citations, those don't count towards your words. But I would suggest Chicago just so it's easier for your judges and teachers to read and easier for doing your word count. If you do an oral history or any correspondence and interview, things like that, those should be cited in your bibliography. You don't need to attach them in an appendix or anything like that. But on that note, I do want to talk about an appendix. It's not the thing inside you, luckily. The appendix you can use, this is an example from Laura Ball's winning paper. She used it so you can put visuals that you might want to show that are important to your argument into the paper. So it's included after your paper and before the bibliography. And they're just really quick. If you want an example of an appendix and how you can use it, I would just suggest Laura Ball's paper, which you can find on our website. Citations. Citations are required. I don't believe we had many that rolled through regionals without them. Citations have to be internal documentation, so either an endnote or a footnote. You can see Laura Ball's example here where it's in Chicago style versus MLA. MLA is that in-text citation you might be used to in English class. They prefer that, but in college you'll see a lot more professors will prefer Chicago style. So it's worth looking into. It does save you a little bit more space, and sometimes it's easier to count words if you do Chicago. And then papers, really easy, like probably what you do in class anyway. The 1-inch margins, do one type of font throughout the paper is what my suggestion is, and then 12 point. Remember, your judges are old. They can't read well. And then here's specifically in the rule book, it should not be enclosed in a binder, cover, anything like that. Make it simple, just print it off the paper and send it in. All right, rules, pretty easy. I will guess you guys have no questions. I'll be just fine. Suggestions, though. This is something I've gone to all the regionals this year, and I've seen a couple examples of different things I want to suggest for students. I'm going to always suggest the theme. It must be in your thesis, and I'm also going to suggest not losing it in your paper. This is one of the biggest issues we see year after year, is you tell me Jesse Owens took a stand, and then you give me a biography about Jesse Owens. I lose that thesis, that argument that you're trying to make, that he took a stand. So make sure you keep it up. Use it not only in your thesis, but in your conclusion. And then also don't make that theme stop you from being critical. Another thing we've seen a lot this year is students picking topics that they love, which is great. But then we lose that critical element. So when we have a student that absolutely loves Abraham Lincoln, sometimes it seems like you don't get critical enough. So what we want to do is make sure that that theme doesn't stop you from being critical. So you can always bring up a counter argument. Abraham Lincoln could have took a further stand by doing such and such. I'll talk a little bit more about being critical later on too. Organization is always a great one. For exhibits, websites, and papers, I often think organization is a really strong point, and it really helps us read through it. So as a reader, I like being able to read either thematically in a paper or chronologically. Chronologically, I think, is the most common one, which is great. It's what we can expect. And I also love seeing headers, breaking up your paper into different sections. It also can keep you on point. As you'll see later, how I would suggest organization is a little strict. So if you use headers and keep yourself in a direction, making sure that your words all relate to one topic in your paper, I think that's a good way of doing it. Making sure supporting materials are referenced. So if you reference 2 books in your annotated bibliography, I would highly suggest that you include them in your paper as well. A historian, John Smith, brought up in his book. That's a good way of introducing a historian, a credible source, and then backing up what you just said. I would also suggest for students to look up length of quotes and at what point in MLA or Chicago formatting you have to indent in. It just makes it easier to read. So usually if it's after 1 or 2 lines of a quote, you're supposed to indent in. So here's a sample organization. I did a paper in my 8th grade year. And so I understand it is often hardest to rewrite and write again, but it's often easier to kind of reorganize, take what you've already written and see how you can fit it together. So an organization that I see that fits well for a National History Day is starting with that introduction. It includes that theme and thesis very clearly, unlike my speaking apparently. And then in your background, you're not talking about your topic yet, but how does it get there? So it's getting to the points where, we don't talk about Rosa Parks right away and taking that stand on the bus, but talking about how did that happen. We talk about the Black codes, we talk about slavery, all of the factors that led up to Rosa being important in history. Then we kind of go into rising action is what we often include in the next part. So Rosa Parks herself did have a life before her taking a seat, so you introduce it in a short amount. You see that you don't even talk about your person or event until probably about the second part. That's something to consider. This isn't a biography. This is kind of an argument that you're going to be making. Then we talk about the main event. So pick that major stand and please back it up with that thesis, that argument, things like that. Then we kind of break the impact into 2 parts. So Rosa Parks, a year to 5 years afterwards, we have the rising civil rights movement, we have the bus boycotts, and then we talk into the long term. It's 10 plus years. Some of you guys might have more current topics, and so 10 years would be, 10 years ago at this point. But getting into the long term, some of them might be longer even now. So Christopher Columbus, why is he important today? Or when did their importance end? Is another way to look at it. If you have more of an obscure topic, you might have to address that question. And then tie it together with a conclusion. I always ask for that theme again. You'll notice that I'll bring it up often because that is one of the changing parts about National History Day. I would also always suggest that you have an English teacher proofread it. There's also some online or grammar and spelling systems. If you're interested in those, they're all online. I'll try to find some links and post them. Things to make your reading and writing look better without even having to talk to a real person. It's pretty great. Here's some tips on phrasing. We saw a lot of these throughout different regionals. Looking up synonyms is always great. And so instead of saying said, we want to see that you're using more charged words, because we've seen a lot of people that are standing up, but let's talk about advocating. Let's talk about, not just thinking of an idea, but proposing the groundbreaking idea. So tell me how that's different than the statements that have been before. Another thing that we've seen that's been kind of lacking in student projects this year is balance. And so we've already said that students have already loved their projects a lot, and it's hard to get critical about someone you love. So thinking about the arguments, Rosa Parks, on the other hand, what were things that were going on? Did everyone truly love her during the time, or did she really face some opposition? In the face of controversy, Charles Darwin really did take a stand. In support of his argument, he published books. He spoke out. And did it work out for him is kind of a question. And so getting into these deeper critical points is something that judges will love. Seeing that you've thought about how did Rosa Parks and Charles Darwin, or whoever you're talking about, whatever event you have going, is against the grind of the current time. If you are getting close to the word count, and then if you are trying to look at how you're going to squeeze everything in, I would kind of ask two questions to how would you cut down on your words. I would talk about, is it proving how your topic is significant in history? And then, does this information support my argument? So think of those two things when you're trying to cut down on words. If you're seeing that, you're kind of running over in one section, but you haven't talked about long-term impact yet. Go through your other parts of your paper and ask, does it prove significance? Does it support my argument? If it doesn't, you can likely remove it. So for research, I love research, first off, working from the Wisconsin Historical Society, and likely you will have professors, college students, teachers, and others that will be judges at the state event. Keep in mind, they love research. I would highly suggest looking up the difference between primary and secondary sources. I do not want to see any wiki quote or anything like that for primary sources. In fact, I don't want to see any wiki quote at the state event if I could. But suggestions for primary sources and trying to bulk up your research before the state event. I would say that you need several newspaper articles. They are all free online at this point. We digitalize almost everything here in Wisconsin, and you can find it on BadgerLink, which I've talked about in other webinars as well. BadgerLink, you can log in through your public library card, and you can get access to thousands of articles online. I would also suggest speeches, government documents, letters. Those are all great primary sources. You can find those on like archives.gov. There's specific museums. Many of your topics likely have their own museum. I would likely Google them and try to find some original documents of the time. For secondary sources, I always love seeing books. I told the La Crosse regional students this. Telling me that you went to a public library really does impress a lot of people. There's interlibrary loan, even if your library does not have the books that you need. I would highly suggest checking that out. It's pretty easy. They will ship books to you from any library in Wisconsin, which is great news for you all because there are almost 3 million materials in the library I work at in Madison, and we can ship that to you, which is all good news. There's also several academic quality journal entries that I want to see. In your school, you probably have EBSCO or Gale Group. I'd highly suggest asking your school librarian or your public librarian if you guys have access to that, and then really do look into it. It's written by people that have PhDs. They've done a lot of research on the subjects. It's really worth your time. All right. So I'm going to stress this on this point as well. Use of quotes versus if you've done an exhibit before where it's limited to 500 words. A lot of exhibit students will use quotes to supplement what they have to say. So instead of saying Pearl Harbor happened on this date, they just have a newspaper article saying it instead, so that it's not counting towards their own student-composed words. That has a hard limit of 500 words. I'd suggest for use of quotes in papers, quotes should provide the supporting evidence in papers. It's not your argument or analysis, and it's also not providing just the facts. So maybe having a quote that has the other person's voice, or something that happened of the time that you can't really rephrase in a better way. That's a good use of quotes. So exhibits, a lot of students will just throw a whole lot of quotes all over it. I'd say for papers, it actually kind of breaks the voice. And so make sure you're using quotes strategically in papers. If it's saying you're using a government document because you really like the specific words it has in there, that's a good use of a quote. Don't just put an inspiration quote in the middle of your paper. All right, so I want to also talk about some resources for you guys. Our wisconsinhistory.org site has some really good research sites listed. We've been compiling them for years as we've been hosting National History Day at Wisconsin since 2001. Which is probably older than everyone on this call. There's also the example paper from Laura Ball. If any of you met her last year, her paper is currently on our site. It is in UCLA's library because of the quality of the research, and it won nationals. So I would highly suggest looking at her paper for several reasons. Badgerlink I already brought up, and I think it would be a worthwhile search for everybody. Newspaper articles have been floating around forever at this point. And then our YouTube channel, the rules webinar, it has the description down below where you can click exactly where you need to be. And then the research webinar will show you a couple different ways to find different types of research. And then there's also the thesis how-to on our YouTube channel. That one kind of breaks down thesis and how we often describe it to students. If you got any comments from your judges about that. All right, I know I went fast. I wanted to save some time for questions, but let me know one way or another on our NHD Gmail. So it's NHD in Wisconsin at gmail.com, and we'll try to answer those as quick as we can. I will be posting this webinar online for everyone to view, and thank you so much for writing papers. They are really my favorite category.